Well, is it time to sacrifice big government? Our next guest sure thinks so. Citizens for the Republic, Executive Vice President Bill Pascoe. This is a grassroots organization that was actually founded by Ronald Reagan. And I want to get his take on not only the State of the Union address last night from President Obama, but whether or not he thinks the Republicans are going to do a whole heap better. Bill, how are you?
I'm good, Phil. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I assume you watched last night, as a lot of people did. What'd you think of the speech?
I watched with great interest. Overall takeaway is that President Obama is certainly talking the talk of a fiscal conservative, but he is not walking the walk. When you actually look into what he proposed last night, the National Taxpayers Union Foundation came out this morning with an analysis. They went through everything that he talked about, both on the pro-spending and the pro-cutting side, and they netted it out at a $21 billion speech.
Yeah, I was just reading that. It's $21 billion more, not less.
That's right. In new spending, additional spending. This is his takeaway from the November election. I guess his takeaway is not that we need to cut spending or even really freeze spending. We just need to increase spending by a little bit less than we increased spending last year.
Well, that's what Democrats call cuts in Washington, though. It's less than what they wanted. It's a cut.
That's right. It's a remarkable takeaway. Let's talk about a couple things. First off, the big headline, of course, is that he called for a 5-year federal spending freeze. Well, that sounds great on the face of it, but when you got to stop to consider that 2 years ago federal spending was at $3.1 trillion a year. Last year's budget, he proposed $3.9 trillion. So there's about a 25% increase there in just 2 years. We don't know what the 2012 fiscal budget is going to be proposed. We haven't seen that budget proposal. We won't see that for a couple of weeks, but I guarantee it's going to be over $4 trillion.
Right. So he wants to freeze that. So it's going to be over 30 or 40% increase from 2 years ago.
Exactly. That's not a way to reduce spending. That's not a way to reduce the deficit. That's locking in the gains that you've made.
Right.
That's the first point. The second point, he called for $400 billion in spending savings over 10 years. We'll do the math on that. That's $40 billion a year he
That's
wants
nothing.
to save. The CBO came out this morning with a revised estimate for the fiscal deficit for this current year, $1.5 trillion.
A record.
And he wants to save us $40 billion a year?
Yeah.
That's not even chump change.
Well, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. So the Republicans, though, they want to go back, though, Bill, to 2008 and do a freeze there. But look, if we went back to 2004, we could balance the budget. Why don't they just do that?
Well, that's right. Now, the Republicans moved a bill through the House yesterday that would take the current year's spending, and remember, the fiscal year of the government goes from October 1 to September 30, so we're already 4 months into the fiscal year. And what they're proposing in their new spending program is to take this current year's fiscal spending back to FY 2008 levels, and then what we're supporting actually, we're not proposing it, we're not members of Congress, unfortunately, but we're supporting a bill that's been introduced just a few days ago by Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio and Congressman Scott Garrett of New Jersey, and Senator Jim DeMint in the Senate from South Carolina has introduced this. It's called the Spending Reduction Act. What it does is it goes back to 2008 levels for this year, but then goes back to 2006 levels for the next 10 years.
Now we're talking.
Now you're talking serious savings. You're talking about saving $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years.
Right, not $400 billion.
Chunk. Not $400 billion. No, 6 times that much.
Well, are you disappointed though, Bill? Because you guys are with an organization that was actually founded by Ronald Reagan, who tried to get a lot of this done. We got the tax increases. Unfortunately, Reagan, the entire time he was there, his budgets were considered dead on arrival. If we'd had Reagan's budgets, we'd actually balance the budget by 1989, but the Democrats wanted to pass their own budgets instead. But being fiscally conservative as you are the Republicans doing enough?
I think we've seen some movement in the right direction. Now, we've got House Republicans have already promised, as part of the rules of the House, what they did on the very first day was pass a package that included no earmarks. No earmarks will come out of the House. And by the way, one other thing that we got to go back to last night, the President promised last night that he would veto any bill that came to him that had earmarks in it. And I thought, wow, okay, so he's taken up the House Republicans. Well, this morning they're already backing off that. Now they promise they've clarified his remarks, clarified in quotes, of course, and what he promises now is he'll veto any bill that's got special interest earmarks. Well, I don't know what that means. But that's his way of letting Harry Reid know don't worry, Harry, you can go ahead and get your earmarks.
Right. Just if we like them, we'll call them just earmarks. If we don't like them, we'll call them special interest earmarks.
That's it. Russell Long, the guy who was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee for many years, was famous for an old saying. He said, "Don't tax you and don't tax me. Tax that fellow behind the tree."
Right.
Now, don't go after my earmarks. Go after somebody else's earmarks.
Well, that's right. Not in my backyard. It's the same type thing. Everybody wants all sorts of reform, and they want to do things, get things done. But if it affects them in a negative way, they don't want it. But the thing about it is the budget. If we're going to cut it, and I mean not just slow the growth as the Democrats call cuts, we're talking about actually cutting it. You're talking about if we do this bill that you were talking about from Congressmen Garrett and Jordan and Senator DeMint, that we're going to actually in a couple of years we'll be using really the blueprint for 2006 as far as spending, but it won't be the same spending matrix. In other words, we won't be spending on the same thing. We'll just take that budget number, and then they'll have to figure out how to allocate the number. Is that right?
That's correct, because one thing we've seen over the last 4 years, or the last 5 years in particular, since this increase in the deficit, what does that do to our interest costs?
Right.
We've got to pay more and more in interest costs every year. Just like a family that's running the tab on the credit card, there comes a point when you're paying more in interest than you are on the outstanding principal. And that's the point of the real tipping point when you get into serious trouble here. So, look, when you are driving a car towards a cliff and you change drivers, the idea is to change direction, not just ease up on the gas a little bit.
Right.
It doesn't do us any good to get to the cliff just a little bit slower. We need to change direction. And changing direction in this case means actually cutting spending, not just slowing the rate of increase. That's the Washington game. You're absolutely right. They call it a cut. If they plan to increase a program by $100 billion and they only decide to increase it by $80 billion, they call it a cut. No, that's an $80 billion increase.
That's right.
In anybody's household.
Well, you're talking about the cliff and getting close. Our good friends across the pond over there in Europe have been to that cliff, and now we see them coming back on the other side, on the other lane, and they're flashing the light saying, "Don't go there," and we continue at full steam ahead, don't we?
That's exactly right. And Paul Ryan, the Republican budget chairman in the House, who gave the official response last night, talked about that. Mentioned some of the countries in Europe and how their day of reckoning has arrived. One thing that I found interesting, nobody was talking about it last week. There was a minor piece of news out of Great Britain. The National Health Service is now going to let doctors make spending decisions instead of bureaucrats.
Really? Doctors?
Yeah. Doctors are once again going to be allowed to prescribe medicine.
That's unbelievable.
Instead of bureaucrats. And they're not doing it. Now, the sad part is they're not doing it because they finally figured out after 60 years of the National Health Service that it doesn't provide proper medical care. They're doing it because they can't afford to do it any other way. The bureaucrats have just gotten in the way, and they finally figured out they need to put power back in the hands of the doctors.
So they're eventually they've come back to what we're doing now, and they're saying this is really the way that works.
That's exactly right. And if the National Health Service in Great Britain can make that change, well, for goodness sake, the United States needs to take a lesson from that.
Indeed, but it's all good talk, and the House is run by the Republicans, but the Senate is not, and the president is who he is. How confident are you that we're going to actually see some real change?
I think what we're going to see for the next 2 years is a fight.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is going to be a prolonged battle, and the good news is we've got a firm base in the House. We've increased the numbers, not just of Republicans, but more importantly to me, we've increased the numbers in the Republican Study Committee, which is a subset of the House Republican membership. These are truly committed fiscal conservatives. We got 89 of them to sign a letter saying to the Republican leadership saying, hey, we promised that we were going to cut spending by $100 billion. So even though we're 4 months into this fiscal year, don't be thinking that we can get away with only cutting $70 billion this year because we're already 4 months into the year. We promised $100 billion. We need to cut $100 billion just as a down payment, just to show people we're serious. We've got a much bigger election. President Obama is right. Elections have consequences, and he was elected for a 4-year term, and that gives him the right to propose a budget for 4 years. Republicans took control of the House in November of 2010. We've got control for 2 years, and what we're going to see for the next 2 years going into that 2012 presidential election is, I think, positioning. Republicans are going to make clear what their philosophy of government is. Democrats are going to do the same. on their side. And what's important to me is the non-official Republican response last night by Michelle Bachmann, speaking on behalf of the Tea Party. Because the Tea Party, remember, they're not Republicans. They are conservatives. They're acting outside the Republican Party. I think the good news for the Republican Party is that 18 months ago, the Tea Party activists across the country decided that it would be better for their own political goals to work inside the Republican Party rather than create a third party. If they had created a third party, the election results in November of 2010 would have been very, very different.
Oh, absolutely.
And by staying inside, by working inside the Republican Party, that gives them a certain amount of leverage, and they can truly hold the Republican leadership's feet to the fire. And I think that's going to be necessary. Washington is a place that has a way of corrupting people insidiously and subtly, and they may not even know that it's happening. You come here and you get seduced. And the Tea Party is there to make sure that the new Republican leadership isn't about to be seduced, or they know they will pay a price.
Well, the question is, have the Republicans really gotten the message? Because right after the November elections, they went along with this extension of unemployment benefits, which cost us an arm and a leg. We didn't have any money to pay for it, but they called that compromise. And I'm worried about it when they say, well, we're going to have to compromise.
Well, I'm with you, Phil. I think we talked about it at the time. Citizens for the Republic was one of the first groups to come out when that tax compromise was announced, and we said, no, this is not a good compromise. This will not help the economy. You know, the president talked about it last night. He mentioned it, talking about how we passed tax cuts, and I was stunned. We didn't pass any tax cuts. That compromise wasn't about tax cuts. It was about maintaining the current rates. It was about preventing a tax increase, but nobody's taxes were cut.
No, that's right, exactly. And if we were going to help the economy, we would have been cutting taxes, but we didn't.
Exactly. We didn't. These guys have a way of using words, and I don't know whether people who get jobs at CNN and the New York Times never went to college, or whether they never learned to speak the English language.
Well, I think the problem is they did go to college, but they went to the wrong ones where they were brainwashed.
That may be, but the president is using language last night that if you actually go to the dictionary definition of the words he was using and then match it up against what's actually happened, he was saying an awful lot last night that just wasn't so.
Well, normally you would say that a lie, right? To be polite.
You might say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Okay. All right. Well, look, you can find out more about Citizens for the Republic at cftr.org. The Executive Vice President, Bill Pascoe. Bill, appreciate it very much.
Always a pleasure to talk with you, Phil. Take care.
Thank you, sir. All right.